The opinions expressed in this program are not necessarily those of the Dad Talks Project. Please, go sue somebody else.
You know, my dad and I didn't have what you would call a close relationship. That's not to say that he was a bad guy. He wasn't. He was a great guy. It's just that I'm the youngest of 7 kids. You know, a single income family, 7 kids, that's not exactly the recipe for a close connection, right? I think the unwritten expectation in my house between my mom and my dad and me was that my brothers and sisters were going to do the heavy lifting as far as raising me went. And they did. And I think they did an okay job. It was them, TV, rock and roll, civil rights movement, cartoons. I mean, all those things kind of worked together to inform who I was ultimately going to become, right? And that's why I think when I found out that I was going to be a dad, I struggled in my mind to find an example that I could use. What do I draw upon? Who did I see as a dad? My 3 sons. Andy Griffith, Courtship of Eddie's father. Those are the guys that I got my parenting chops from, right? And you know, the one thing I noticed about this TV dads is that they all gave really great advice. They always had that stuff in their hip pocket. The orchestra would swell and they would really connect with their kids and they'd tell them exactly what they needed to hear to get them through the situation. Boom, perfect. So to me, that's what dads did. So when I found out that I was going to be a dad, I started making notes. And I started gathering my life experiences and starting to think in terms of how can I communicate this wisdom with my kids when they're here. And then they came. And the opportunity to connect with them just did not present itself, to say the least. Yeah, the first few years of any kid's life is just about keeping them alive, you know, about keeping them from killing themselves. Don't fall down the stairs. Don't put a fork in a socket. Don't pull that wild animal's tail. But then they started to get older, a little more sentient, a little more able to grasp some higher concepts. And the moment they did, they checked out on me. They discovered the internet and computers and iPads and Minecraft and YouTube. And they got smarter because of it. So it's not like I actually wanted to limit their time so much. You know, they're good kids. They're smart and they learn by virtue of their own distractions. So I didn't feel right sitting them down and forcing my wisdom upon them. I don't think that would have gone too well if I would have made that decision to go that way anyway. But then I'm sitting there and I've got all these notes. I took the notes. I did my job. I took the notes. When do I get to share this stuff, right? I did what was expected of me. I got my Fred McMurray locked and loaded, yo. No dice. What do I do with this stuff? And then one happy Sunday, I'm home watching TV and Superman comes on. Happens to be the part of Superman where Superman's a young teenager, a little angsty guy, you know, can't understand why he can fly, why he can bend steel with his hands, why he can run faster than a train, a speeding locomotive. And his Earth dad, sensing this existential crisis, takes him out to the barn for one of those father-son moments, raises up the barn floor, and shows him the craft that he came to Earth in. And he pulls this crystal cylinder out of his pocket and says, you know, found this in there with you too. So Superman instinctively knows that he's got to take this crystal and fly to the Fortress of Solitude, put the little crystal into the crystal receptacle, which until this moment, I have to think he had no idea why he'd ever built. And as soon as he puts that crystal tube into the receptacle, boom, up pops Jor-El, 3D holographic Jor-El. And Jor-El begins to tell him where he comes from. What happened to, you know, this is your planet. These are your people. This is what happened to your planet. This is why you're so strong on Earth. This is the nature of your powers. Blah. He doesn't stop there, though. He goes forward a little bit and he says, this is what you do with this. This is what you do with these powers. This is your morality. This is your obligation as part of the universe. Fantastic. That's fantastic. That's exactly what I was looking for. That's dad's giving advice. But Jor-El got it right. He didn't take his kids aside in some well-lit scripted moment and deliver his advice while the orchestra swelled behind him. No, he put it in pay-per-view, on demand. He put it there so his progeny could find it as they needed it. Perfect. So with that idea, the Dad Talks Project was born. This is dads recording their advice to their kids and putting it in a place where they can access it whenever they need it. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the Dad Talks Project. And thanks for joining us. Bill and his wife have 2 young sons, and they are cool. His kids are great. And when you meet kids like this, you gotta step back and say, what are they doing? What are the parents doing that's so right? This doesn't just happen organically. So I chased Bill down and I asked him to be part of the Dad Talks project. Thankfully, he said yes. And sit back and watch. And I think you'll get a little idea about where cool kids come from. Here's Bill.
This talk serves to replace 20 or more years of fatherly, misguided advice in the event I'm not there to give it to you. If you're watching this and I'm still alive, remember that everything I've said since I've been on the stage supersedes what you're about to hear. That said, be brave. If you're not brave, pretend. It's true what they say, nobody can tell the difference. If you're in an office building and a squirrel sneaks in, be the guy who grabs the box to capture it. If a bully is hurting somebody, be the guy who stands in front of them and says, stop. And get in front of 1,000 or 100 or 10 people on stage and tell them your mind or give the performance of your life. At the beginning, nobody's going to know how afraid you are. And if you practice grace and calm under pressure, maybe they never will. When it comes to your family, they can teach you better than I could ever teach you. In particular, from my father, I've learned these lessons. Always treat people fairly and with sincere interest. Always be polite. Always. Unless you're a bouncer at Roadhouse, you have no exception to that rule. And finally, every once in a while, if not every day, try to make something instead of do something. And then there are the lessons he told me. Cut it long and kick it into place. That's a carpentry expression, but have fun trying to apply it to your real life. Take 2 trips if you have to. Usually he told me this right before I broke something really expensive by trying to carry too much. And finally, know when to quit. This one's kind of cheating. He would often tell this to your uncle and me when we were either fighting or laughing way too loud, way too long at something way too stupid. But often in life, people will tell you, you should never quit, you should never surrender, never give up. There are cases when that's really bad advice indeed. For instance, quit a job you no longer believe in. Quit a friendship when it does more harm than good. Quit drinking, quit smoking, quit cursing. But never quit loving, laughing, learning, and for as long as possible, living. Girls are pretty much exactly like boys, except they can get pregnant. Don't do that to a girl unless you both really mean it. Also remember, no means no, drunk means no, and silence means no. Boys have been cursed with better than average strength and much worse than average sense. Girls have for ages been fending off unwanted advances of men. If you see a girl or a boy who you're really interested in, it's okay to approach them once, politely. If they say no, move on and get over it. All these stories and movies you see where the persistence pays off and the guy finally wins the girl's heart, they're missing one important point, and that is, it was a stalker who got really lucky and possibly avoided jail time. Next slide, please. All right, I've never had too much use for religion, and I'm certainly no expert. But I did grow up in a small town church where they would always get together to help members in need and refugees across the world. So I guess small town church is good. Try to avoid televangelists and mega churches, and just listen to what they have to say and decide for yourself if it makes any sense. I'm thinking Scientology should be right out. Throughout your life, you're going to encounter many people who are figures of authority. There'll be bosses, judges, police officers, and hopefully not prison guards, commanding officers, religious leaders. In any event, respect their position, but know that they're just people like you and me. They have the same hopes, fears, anxieties as we do. The same goes for politicians, for celebrities, and for captains of industry. They're no different than you, they're no better than you, they're no worse than you. It's hard to treat all strangers exactly the same. It's human nature when you first meet somebody to put them in a category that's easy to identify. Just know that this is trafficking in stereotypes and bias. Maybe you'll never quite stop being able to avoid this, but if you can admit that it's the wrong thing to do and recognize it, you can hopefully minimize the consequences. You'll have both lifelong and fleeting friendships that only last 5 or even 1 year. Both of these kinds of friendship are very valuable, and you should do what you can to nurture them. Put effort into both and you'll find joy, and hopefully give some joy as well. All right, you can pause the internet now until you're old enough to either vote or drink, and pick it up at that point. We're back, great. Okay. Yeah, next slide. All right, travel. You should do this as often and as early as possible. Few adventures have started with somebody staying in bed all day. So grab a friend, a loose plan, and go for it whenever you possibly can. I don't know how everyone else's career progresses, but in my case, every job I've had from busboy to my current career have been in part due to people I know and connections I've made in previous jobs or school or friends. It's important to nurture these relationships, and they will take you very far, but remember, they only get you in the door. After that, you have to prove your ability and your interest and your willingness to learn and strive to be great. As far as working is concerned, always try to do your job better one day than you did it the day before. If you find yourself getting worse at a job over a long period of time, maybe it's time to look somewhere else. All right, I don't have much to say about this, but one thing I can tell you, it isn't a sacred ritual. Have fun, but be safe. And finally, know your limits and then strive to go beyond them. It's better than okay to recognize your failings, because unless you understand your faults and your shortcomings, you'll never be able to outgrow them. Good luck, boys. I love you. Have a great life.
Good talk, son. You know, adoption is one of those things. I think we all know what it is, certainly the definition of adoption, but I don't think we all understand what's involved in it. And it seems to me a weird cocktail of legalese and love, a smash up of those two entities in a very unsettling way. But when the dust clears, you have a child. You know, it's not for everybody. Very few people actually go the adoption route. Fewer people still actually use adoption to add to their existing family. Enter Marke Dickinson. He and his wife and his 3 biological kids sought to adopt a 4th. And the great thing about Mark, as you're about to find out, after the adoption was over, it was not even an issue. Mark is just a dad. They're a family. Let's listen to Mark's story.
Well, I grew up about 30 miles sort of northwest of here, a small town in Lancaster County called Gap. my sister, I have one older sister who's 3.5 years older than me, and she and I grew up in a house primarily just with my mother. When I was about 6 months old, my dad enlisted in the Marine Corps. The Vietnam War was going on at that time, and so he enlisted to serve. And really, from that point forward, was never really present in my life in terms of, raising my sister and I, and kind of being there on an ongoing basis. He would come home from time to time when he was on leave from service, but even then, it wasn't really sort of a relationship. It was sort of a check-in. So my family unit really was my sister and I with our mother, and the blessing was that we lived right next door to my mother's parents, my grandparents, and they provided, along with some neighbors and lots of family, really the support structure around us to help us really, grow up without a glitch, really.
So now, flash forward to your own kids. I mean, you're obviously you're invested in your kids. Were there any? And you had daughters, so you had a sister. You kind of saw how she was treated coming up, and did that inform how you treated your daughters, who were the first two kids out of the block for you, or?
Not necessarily. I'll tell you, I really kind of felt like I had to figure it all out myself, because what I saw at home was a mother-daughter relationship, which, I understood, but it wasn't really the relationship that I was going to have with my daughters. So quite honestly, I figured it out as I went along, and Marke bore the brunt of my figuring out, because she was the first one to come through. But, that's not all bad. It's in a way, it's authentic. I didn't have the bad habits that I grew up with. I didn't have the downsides or the things that weren't necessarily done well. I could create from a clean slate what I wanted that relationship to be. And, looking back now, that both girls are adults, I think it's worked out really well. I think maybe if you ask them, hopefully they'd say it's worked out pretty well. But honestly, I wrote the book, one chapter at a time. And figured it out as I went through.
Well, they didn't run from the house screaming, right? I mean, you stay in touch. It's not like they're like, I can't wait to get out of here. Virginia's not far enough. I'm going to move to Alaska or something. So you must have done something, right? You stay.
By that measure, yes, I've done something right. Yes.
Excellent. And they sound lovely and high achieving.
They are. They really are. And, there's a book that I came across probably about 10 years ago entitled Strong Fathers, Strong Daughters. And I worked my way through that book, and it was amazing how that relationship is so important for daughters, that if the daughters who have what would be viewed as strong fathers, not necessarily physically strong, but just emotionally strong for them and always there for them and sort of a rock, they have stronger personalities, they have more self-confidence, higher self-esteem, they tend to achieve more, I think, in life in general, than daughters who don't. So in some way, I think even before I encountered that book, I've always wanted to be the strong pillar for the girls, whatever that means to them. If in whatever way they need me to be strong. If they need me to be strong physically, I'm strong physically. But in any way, I just want to be that strong rock. And I think that's formed a part of their personality and who they are today. I see both of them as really strong girls when it comes to how they view dating and the whole, involvement with guys. They have very high standards. They don't just dive in because they're falling for some line that the guy gives them. They really, are sincere and serious about that. And I think that comes from, at least in part, having a strong sense of who they are and their value and their worth that I contributed to. By no means was I like the only piece of that, but I think that I helped that in some way.
I want to build on that, because that touches on a thing
Speaking of.
Yeah, right. Every father of daughters whose daughters haven't reached that age level yet, who are like they're still dealing with like 11 and 10-year-old girls. What was it like for you when they started dating? Were you like, I'm gonna kill somebody, or like, did you like have a shotgun that you polished, or like how did you brace yourself for that, and how was your transition into that whole thing?
Wow. Well, I'll tell you, it's interesting. Transition was hard and still is hard. So, you know, I think I fall into the category of dads who believe there's no guy who is fully worth their daughter, right? So, and it's just like, I don't know, it's just I can't shake that, right? So if that's kind of my standard, it's just difficult for me to see and to, you know, warm up to other guys. Part of that might be because as a guy, I know what, you know, kind of goes through your mind at 17, 18, and 22, and I don't really want that for my girls. But what I tried to do to sort of deal with that is to just be fairly firm. So I don't want to be the kind of dad that if a guy comes to the house, you know, looking for my daughter, that they feel like, oh, he's a pushover. It's like he's not even there. You know, he's just, don't worry about him. I want them to know, no, Dad is there. He's very much present, and he very much values that girl.
And he's watching everything you do.
Everything you do. Everything you do. It's funny. My oldest daughter, tells a story about when we lived in Michigan, and she went to a party at a friend's house. There was a guy there who was interested in her at the party, and when I went to either drop her off or pick her up, she introduced me to him and said, "Hi, Dad, this is so-and-so, so-and-so, this is my dad." And I looked him in the eye and I shook his hand very firmly. And, you know, I didn't think much of it, but when she came home that night, she's like, "Dad," whatever this guy's name is, he said, "Your dad shakes your hand like a slave owner. I mean, this guy, he crushed my hand." You know, the guy, apparently, he still talks about that. This is like 10, 12 years later. But, you know, I think there are ways to signal, whether subtly or not so subtly, that I stand behind her, and, you know, watch yourself. Be careful. Treat her with respect.
So I have to ask you this: when you catch up with I'll go with your oldest child, your older daughter, on the phone, what number question does that? Is she seeing anybody? Is she in a relationship?
You know what? You're going to laugh. I really don't know. It's one of those things that she doesn't talk a lot about with me. She talks with her mother about those things, I think, a lot more, which is good. I think that's healthy. But I don't think she wants to pull me into every guy encounter or interest that she might have. And it may be a way of protecting me, I don't know, but I think it might be a way of protecting me, because I would have emotion around it and concern around it and all those things. So, you know, she definitely introduces it when it's something that's at a point where she wants me to know that person and for that person to know me. But the everyday, hey, I met this guy and he seems really cool and interesting, and you know, we might go to dinner next week. I never get any of that. So, you know, and so I said, I'm not perfect in this. Maybe that's the downside of being as firm as I am, or having that kind of disposition I have about guys, is that, you know, my daughters probably feel like unless the guy passes several screens and we're really going to go somewhere, it's not worth even broaching this with Dad. Don't talk to Dad about casual male relationships. It's not going to be good.
You're the closer. You're the closer that they keep in the bullpen when they're in trouble. And it's got, yeah, I need the strikeout. You're the guy that comes out to the mound like, that's it, I got this. So
I like that. I don't mind being the closer.
Let's talk about your sons for a minute. What the relationship between your sons and your daughters, was there a protectiveness in that at all?
Very much so. Especially my oldest son, Isaac. In fact, if you talk to Marke, my oldest daughter, she would tell you that Isaac's harder on the guys than I am, which is kind of hard to believe, but I think he is. So guy comes over to take her to dinner, and he'll say, what's your phone number? And the guy will give him his phone number, and he'll go try it to make sure that it works. He didn't give him a bogus number. And he's like, what time are you going to have Marke back? He asks all the stuff that normally the dad would ask. And he just doesn't budge an inch. He's not impressed. You're not going to bamboozle. You're not going to soften him up by playing basketball or video games. He's still like, this is my sister. So I think that's kind of special. And while I think maybe at first they didn't appreciate it as much, it's like, oh, there's my stupid brother. Just ignore him. He's going to be a jerk. Just ignore him. But I think, as they get older, I think it's kind of a cool thing to them that they have a brother who loves them so much that he wants to make sure that nobody takes advantage of him. And our youngest son, I think, is in his own way, I think, has that characteristic as well. Really loves his older sisters, especially for our youngest son, Hassan, our oldest daughter. And there's a 10-year age gap there. So I think that gap is just wide enough that, she's almost, not quite, but it's kind of like having an aunt or having when you get a 10-year gap, you take advice in a different way than when there's a 2-year or 3-year gap. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of affection between the boys and the girls.
It's almost like a one-way relationship where the cascades down from the older. Because I know I am the youngest of 7, and my next oldest brother, sister, twins are 7 years older than me. And the thought of me giving them advice and anything, or looking out for them, even now that we're all we're senior citizens, for lack of a better word, it still doesn't happen. No, I'm still the one that if more than 2 of us get together, I'm the one who's like, shh, sit there. We'll get to you in a minute.
Oh, I see. Yeah. So, you still get shushed.
I do. And I'm the biggest one too. I outweighed and outreached and outpunched everybody in my family from the time I was 12 years old. I get no respect. I'll always be the baby. We'll get to you in time. Do you see that dynamic? And before we go further, Hassan is adopted, right?
That's right. We adopted Hassan a little over 4 years ago. He was 9 years old. So, and it's just been a cool addition to our family.
Can you talk about that process a little bit? With 3 children, what inspired you to even pursue that?
Sure. Well, in all candor, I wasn't really inspired. My wife and kids were. This goes back a long way, and I think to really get the authentic story, you'd probably have to talk to my wife, because she felt it long before I did. But she had this sense that she got. Some spiritual sense that we were going to adopt a child. And this was back really around the time that Hassan was born in 2002. And then from that point forward, she, along with my 2 daughters and older son, really started to grab hold of this idea of adopting. And they, would watch the programs on television, with these children, they're wonderful, like Wednesday's Child here in Philadelphia. And they would connect with these adoption agencies and these organizations that help foster children, and they just really exploring it, and were determined that this is something that we should do. And I think for the kids, it was a matter of, we have a great family, we love it, we have so much love, we could help a child, we could take somebody in and really be a blessing to them. For me, I was looking at it, I think the way you kind of described in your opening, we have 3 children. It is a lot of work raising kids, right? It's a lot of work to raise one kid. You have 3 children. It's not like there are 3 of me. It's like there's still one set of parents. Now there are 3 kids. We got to subdivide our time and all our other resources among those kids. If we add a 4th, it just subdivides even further. So, and for me, I thought there comes a point at which you're just less effective at raising kids, right? I don't know where that is, but I'm feeling pretty taxed at 3. So for me, it was a pure, like just rationally thinking this through. I'm good with 3. I'm good to hold there. And, candidly, they just kept working on me. And, I listened, I pondered, I prayed. And at the end, the thing that I think moved me the most was this thought of, as I'm, at the tail end of my life, and I reflect back on, things I'm proud of and maybe things that I wish I had done differently, I would regret having, stood in the way of my wife and kids being able to help and bless a child. I stood in the way because I couldn't get over my own sense of that being too much to handle. And so I thought, well, let me just take this step. Let me just step out and not do that, so I don't have that regret, and explore it. And then I started to get really into it. I was like, yeah, let's do this. I'm in. And so we went through the adoption class and did all the background, checks and everything you have to do to be ready to take a child. And then we just went through the process. So it was kind of, I guess, your standard adoption process where we worked with an agency, and it wasn't necessarily a smooth process. There were several years that went by where we were ready to be placed and couldn't find a match. And then just like it hit Debbie that this is what we were going to do, we get a call from an agency in Delaware that says, hey, we'd love to talk to you about a child we have who, from his profile, we think could be a great match for your family profile. And that was the beginning of the rest of the story.
So as you're going through this story, the one thing that occurs to me, and I'm sure you've thought about this before, but the fact that your children advocated for this whole process to broaden your family, that had to be an incredible point of pride for you, was it not?
It was. It really was. It really was. Because I made it pretty clear. I'm like, I can't grow, two of me. I can't grow, unfortunately, two incomes either. And so what that means is that with the same fixed amount, we've got to subdivide and we've got to meet everybody's needs. So the moral of that story is, you get a little less, okay? So you cool with that? That's what it really means. I mean, we got this kid, he's lovable, but it's not like, bringing a pet into the house where it's only a marginal difference. We're talking about, clothing, feeding, educating, college, all those things. You cool with this? Yeah, sure. We've got plenty. It's fine. And to me, that said more about who they were and their character than probably 100 years of, sort of observing them. It's just, it's not about what you say in theory, but it's kind of about what you do, and for them to be willing to take that act, that selfless act of sharing their family and their resources with another child who's completely unrelated to them, spoke volumes. It really did, and it still does to me.
And when you qualified it initially, the words you used were, they said there's enough love here for everybody. So to them, it wasn't even necessarily like a marketing spreadsheet type of a thing in a division of resources. It was just like, this is cool. We've got to share this as much as we possibly can. And another person can join in, then all the better. Is that?
Yeah, that's right. And I think the subtext of that, so how do you get kids who grow up that way? I don't really know. But I think our kids have never really been self-centered or selfish. Sure, every kid goes through phases where they're more self-absorbed than other phases, but as a general rule, the kids aren't me, mine, get away. And I think because that's who they are and how they've been raised, it shouldn't be so surprising that they're not that precious about what is theirs in terms of, a piece of, my parents', income, and a piece of all the gifts that they can buy and all those things. That's whatever. We got plenty. It's cool.
You mentioned before that your grandfather, who was an influence of you, who you learned a lot about yourself, about how to be a person from watching him. He wasn't necessarily a lecturer. He was I'm moving through life. You watch and you learn. Do you think that your kid, did you take the opportunity to lecture your kids about these? These are kind of high level cerebral approaches to these common problems. Did you actually talk to them about these things, or has it always been, watch me, I'm moving this way, and you learn by watching?
Wow, that's a great question. It's one that I'd love to hear their answer to, because I don't think I'm a very big lecturer per se. I do have some things that I want to impart, and so just as I shared that I told Avery, you got to compete at some level. Otherwise, people will just run all over you, and that's not fair. So in certain examples, I would share a point of view about how I think it's important to compete. But it's mostly been about competing to be the best you that you can be. It's not been, competing to knock others down. And I think Debbie and I live our lives that way. I don't think they see us, in situations where we're trying to cut others down and we're competitive in a nasty or negative way. But we're always striving for excellence. We expect excellence, and to achieve excellence requires some degree of competitiveness. You've got to be competitive to be excellent. But it's how that competitiveness manifests itself that's really important in terms of your character. So that's what we try to instill.